We shall see how this goes. I have a bit of a headache. It almost feels to me like a hangover, and yet I haven't drank anything. La la la. La 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 la. Yeah, this is something that has kind of piqued my interest, the constitutional issue of bonding for work on private land. This is so prevalent right now. Advertising juxtaposed with reality. So interesting. It's a little bit confusing how this process is framed. Issuance of debt by a town or village or city. The issuance of debt, I suppose, being that sale of debt. So issuance and sale is perhaps synonymous here. Excuse me. Interesting. Other than such improvement district matters, town, village, or city bond resolutions do not themselves usually require a public hearing. Okay, sale and award of debt. So there's the sale of debt, award of debt, and issuance of debt that all appear to be synonymous. Incidental benefit is permissible, and there is an abundance of case law on its limitations. Yeah, well, it's interesting because I suppose the municipal debt sort of shifts into municipal credit. So it's both credit and debt simultaneously. Incidental private benefit. Incidental private benefit. Article 8, Section 1 generally prohibits the expenditure of municipal monies for the benefit of private parties, unless it is in furtherance of a proper municipal purpose and is undertaken pursuant to a statutory obligation or properly authorized contract under which the municipality receives fair and adequate consideration. The so-called gift and loan clause. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different variations of vernacular framing. Gifts, loans, sale, issuance, credit. I'm not even honestly quite sure that this is the particular constitutional provision that the City of Troy administration is referring to and talking about the constitutionality of bond issuance and private property. Gift and loan clause. 1874. Gift and loan clause is intended to ensure that municipal resources are used only for public purposes. Anything else would be an impermissible gift from the municipality to the private beneficiary. Public purpose. The gift and loan clause prevents such gifts by prohibiting a municipality from spending money to benefit a private individual except where the expenditure is in furtherance of a public purpose and the municipality is contractually or statutorily required to do so. While the presence of a private benefit does not automatically render the action invalid, the primary beneficiary of the municipal spending or use of municipal resource must be the public. Yeah, see what's interesting here with the sewers and even roads, the main arteries, so to speak, are generally considered to be the responsibility of the municipality to maintain. And these like arteries, so to speak, that flow off the main artery, or these tributaries that sort of flow off the main artery that are privatized, in a way kind of lose that status, or the question is, do they lose that status of, or do they lose that jurisdictional responsibility of the municipality? But when you look at the system as a whole, not differentiating between what is, where the jurisdictional lines begin and end, which I understand why that structure exists, why that delineation exists, so to speak. But when you look at it more as a whole system, do those lines carry over? I guess maybe the question is, where does looking at it as a whole system begin and end? Maybe it's not just the responsibility of the municipality in one area and just the responsibility of a private party, so to speak, in another. Is there some kind of merged, I don't even want to use the word responsibility, but it is what is the response ability? What is the ability to respond? Yeah, there's mutual benefit, but it feels like it's more about where there is mutual consent almost, and consent doesn't even really feel adequate. It's more mutual participation, intentional participation, desire to participate. without feeling some kind of external force and pressure to do so. Yeah. Incidental private benefit. So long as the primary purpose is for the public good. Relies on the touchstone of whether the primary beneficiary is the public or the private entity. Whether the use of the municipal funding or resource furthers a municipal obligation. Further, a municipality cannot use its resources to maintain private property. The provision of these services would afford a private entity an unconstitutional gift of public funds. Although a municipality may establish standards for the maintenance, unless the road is itself public, a municipality has no authority over such a road. I guess my question in that sense is, okay, you have this private road, but is that private road connected to a public sewage system? Is that private road connected to public water infrastructure? Does it matter? For example, while town equipment and town personnel could be used to perform work on private property, if the primary purpose of such work furthers a proper town purpose. The comptroller has opined that municipal equipment is acquired for municipal purposes only. I mean, I guess another question is, when it comes to the lead pipes that are servicing a private property, the question being, is it only serving that private property? Like, is there some kind of contamination of the entire water infrastructure, water system, if a tributary, so to speak, a segment of the whole is contaminated? So is the apparent proposed contamination, possible contamination, whatever, of a segment of the whole, how does that influence the whole? Does it? Or is it more sort of its own closed system? Okay, so this is from 1992. So, Attorney General of New York opinion. A municipality may, however, regulate the maintenance of private roads by their owners. We note that a municipality may require that privately owned roads be maintained by their owners in accordance with reasonable standards. I wonder if a similar notion would be applied to maintenance of water lines, to say that we note that a municipality may require that privately owned water lines be maintained by their owners in accordance with reasonable standards. here. Owners of private roads open to use by the general public. I don't know if that can be plopped onto water lines to say private water lines open to use by the general public. I suppose theoretically lots of noise. I don't know, theoretically, if there is a private property, there's private property that is open to use by the general public, perhaps. Yeah, I'm just thinking, I'm wondering if there are two. So there's this issue about police power trumping sort of private rights. For the maintenance of public health or for the furtherance of the public health and safety. And then there is this question around when that is allowed, when that is reasonable. It's like there's this kind of secondary question around when does that police power, when does the application of that police power, or whether the application of that police power incidentally benefits the private, that which is considered private. So not only this question around there being this public benefit and the police power sort of coming in to take precedence and take sort of supremacy, but then a question of, okay, when that is reasonable, then this question of, does that reasonable application of police power, does it incidentally benefit that which is private? Or does it sort of purely benefit that which is private? But if you're saying already that there is a reasonable police power being enforced, then it almost seems like there would be this sort of assumption that any private benefit would be incidental. Can you have both a reasonable police power applied for the public health and welfare and simultaneously say that it is of pure private benefit? I mean, can they both exist simultaneously? Yes. Opinion of the court. Yeah. I mean, it really just kind of seems like the question is also, really, how does the city relate to the water infrastructure? 1926? 1926. Yeah, I guess what's interesting is, does the city have some contractual agreements in regard to the water infrastructure? Are there contracts for its maintenance with private entities currently in operation, in existence, enforceable? Good morning. The weather feels absolutely glorious in Troy today. We are on the cusp of a heat wave next week, so that'll be quite interesting. I don't have air conditioning, so every summer that when it gets really warm, it's like, okay, going into the trenches. We're gonna make it out. We're gonna do just fine. I had a really interesting thought come through a couple weeks ago when I was, well, I don't remember actually exactly what the context was that I was contemplating, but I somehow arrived at air conditioning, and I haven't had air conditioning for several years. I have, for a couple years, felt resistant to air conditioning, even though it gets quite warm here in the summers, and I really hadn't had any kind of satisfying answer as to why I felt this way about air conditioning. There was nothing logically that really made sense about it. And so the other day I was contemplating, I thought about air conditioning, and all of a sudden it just was like, interesting. Okay, air is very representative, at least in how I understand tarot, how I relate to tarot, and even astrology. Air is often representative of the throat and just communication and even the mental body. And so when I sort of pieced that together with conditioning and how conditioning is often talked about or it's often talked about as the sort of limited constraints that are inherited, so to speak, through the generations, constraints of thought. Sometimes they're referred to as limiting beliefs. But it's even with Pavlov, I believe is his name, Pavlov's dog, and how in psychological contexts, conditioning is sort of it's training. It's sort of synonymous with being trained to behave, to think a certain way. And so in sort of connecting this throat speech communication aspect with this conditioning aspect, there was something that started to come through in that space around, air conditioning, speech training, being trained to, or just the constraints around what is said, the constraints around what is communicated, the constraints around how the mental body processes information and the communication thereof, and how that has sort of been manipulated or like trained to exhibit, to express in a sort of predetermined way, and sort of an inherited, predetermined way. And so I was in contemplating that and connecting that with how I have felt over the last couple of years about air conditioning, and not really quite making that connection between how I felt about air conditioning and the sort of resistance that I had to it, and perhaps some sort of subconscious resistance to that throat communication, that sort of just means of communication being so confined, being so predetermined. So I just kind of found that really interesting as I was contemplating that. And it also kind of, the flip side of that was contemplating sort of what it means to me, or contemplating a more quote unquote sort of purified, clean, natural air flow. I by no means intend for this expression to be a projection of judgment, be a projection of criticism toward any usage of air conditioning units. Several days ago, I did not record this particular record when I read through it, but I believe it was last week. There was an article in the record about a particular area of Troy that is under currently, the article was about how this particular piece of Troy, or this parcel in Troy, which is along the waterfront here, this parcel is, I believe, under contract now for development, development of a, I believe what they're calling an industrial parkway, and that sounds really intense. I believe that that road is for primarily industrial vehicles to traffic, rather than having to go through the streets of the city where there are more residential houses. And so the town, I suppose, for years has wanted to build this industrial parkway to avert this particular kind of traffic. And this article was not only talking about how I believe there to be a finalized contract for that development, it also talked about how that particular parcel where they are building this roadway is being acquired by eminent domain. And it's being acquired by eminent domain because the property, at least a large portion of it currently, the part that is still very undeveloped, and I haven't looked at this whole parcel, I haven't driven by it, so I actually don't know yet how fully developed this road actually is. But there is a part that they have been wanting to acquire for some time. So this eminent domain, it's been over a decade since I've really returned, if you will, to this topic, and so I don't really recall all that much about it legally. I don't remember consciously too much about the process, except that it's a governmental taking of private property for a public purpose with just compensation. And so when I read that the administration was in the process of acquiring property here in Troy along the waterfront for redevelopment through eminent domain, that really struck my interest. And I still have the information. Sometimes I keep tabs open for pieces of information that are interesting to me, but perhaps I don't explore them in that moment. But there is a desire to come back to it. So this tab has been sitting open on my computer for, I guess, about a week now. And it kind of was standing out to me yesterday when I was reading the information regarding New York's constitutionality around using municipal funds where there is some kind of private benefit. And I'm still not 100% sure if the constitutional issue described by the administration here in Troy is directly related to this gifts and loans clause. But that's the rabbit hole that that I went down yesterday. And so it kind of felt connected to this eminent domain information that piqued my interest last week, just because there's this whole thing around sort of governmental, municipal, local, whatever word wants to be used. There's this whole question around governmental authority and ownership of property and ownership of infrastructure within the boundaries of its authority, and how that relates to private property and private rights, and the interesting intersection there and the fine lines. And so this question around what authority does the municipality have to possess, use resources within the sort of city municipal limits, and how does that relate to private property rights and responsibility. And the interesting thing that I was contemplating last night was how, specifically in the context of these water lines, these lead pipe water lines, and with eminent domain, the municipality, see, the interesting thing to me when I was contemplating this last night, and specifically in the context of these water lines here in Troy, is the municipality can come in and claim that under its police power, it has the authority to regulate how these water pipes are maintained for on behalf of the public interest, on behalf of the public health and welfare. Even if those water pipes are possessed, so to speak, privately, on their within the private sort of landscape This is coming out gradually because I'm trying at the same time I'm expressing here to recollect what I was contemplating last night and the way it was coming across last night. There was something about how the municipality's police power can, in a way, sort of take possession or ownership of the maintenance. It can regulate how that infrastructure is to be maintained. And that was sort of in a way akin to zoning regulations, where the town can impose and regulate how a specific property is organized. It was something about how, let me just talk to myself here. It was something about how the town here, I can see how the town would be very hesitant to go ahead with bonding for infrastructural development that creeps into the private property aspect, where they would be using funds to go in on private property to replace water pipes. And whether or not that is considered an incidental benefit or not, setting that aside for just a moment, if the town were to call that under its police power authority to do so, which in effect would sort of trump the private right to resist that infringement is the word that keeps coming through, infringement for lack of a better phrase. It's like the town would be saying, of course it's private. I mean, excuse me. Of course this is for a public purpose. Therefore, your private rights are set aside. So we're acknowledging that there are private rights here that are being trumped by the police power authority to enforce the public health, safety, and welfare, to take care of the public health, safety, and welfare. And then the question sort of comes up, well, if we're admitting that this is a private right, then the question sort of comes up, is it a taking? Is it a taking under eminent domain? But then when considering whether it's a taking, there's this question coming up, well, is the town, is the city, is the municipality taking possession? And that's what I don't recall if with takings and eminent domain, if there has to be a sort of physical possession of the property for it to be considered a taking. Because then you could say, well, the municipality is not physically taking possession of this private property. It's not taking physical possession of this infrastructure. So, but in in effect, in essence, it's taking ownership / possession / authority. It's taking ownership over the maintenance of that property, the maintenance of that infrastructure, and that, to me, is more akin to the zoning, with how municipalities say, well, we're not really, we don't have ownership per se over the possession of the property, or do they? I mean, I guess that's another question. Do they really? Because if you don't pay your property taxes. So I don't know. There's just this weird, quite interesting to me, blurred line between where there is municipal authority, where there is private authority, where there is municipal ownership, where there is municipal responsibility. And so in all of that, I wanted to go back and look at what was going on here in Troy regarding this eminent domain and see what I can find out through digging there, because I think that could be really interesting. See what comes to light. Okay, so let's go up here, blah, blah, blah. Okay. May 2024, the city of Troy, New York, announced that it had settled 3 lawsuits filed in 2022 over a large salt pile on the riverfront. The lawsuits were filed by the owner of 2 properties affected by the pile. The long-desired goal of removing a massive road salt pile from the Hudson River waterfront has been reached under a deal which settles 3 lawsuits over the city's move to seize land by eminent domain. Boom. South Troy Industrial Park Road Construction Project. Situated at south of Adams Street and bearing tax map identification number, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let's take a little look-see at the map really quick. Okay. So they're referring to right in this area here. Right here. So here's Adams Street. Right here. So here's the Industrial Parkway coming up from the south, going north. Here is the Industrial Parkway. I don't know the current state of this roadway. I'm not sure if this is all now municipal owned. I don't have any of that information currently. But I believe the salt pile is right in here. And actually, if I layer it, here is the salt pile. So here's Adams Street, and then south, here is the salt pile. And I believe this is the stretch of property that is being discussed in this particular claim. I believe that this industrial parkway here, I think all of this is either under construction currently or is also part of this settlement. Perhaps more information will come through on that, but they are definitely looking to, the municipality or the city is definitely looking to obtain this particular parcel for the continuation of this industrial parkway. So south of Adams Street. Exhibit A. Whoa. Good Lord. Yeah, these are all the rail lines. Which looks like Madison Street. Okay. Yeah. So this looks like, here's Madison Street right here. Here are these rail lines. Yeah, so they're referring to this plot, like all up in here. Boop, boop, up to Adams Street, I believe. Boop, boop. No. Yeah. That was November of 2022. They were going to get together some cost estimates, but it seems like nothing had moved forward since that point. Over a year later. Yeah, over a year. Maybe, yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if they're the two other cases, if there's status updates there, but I mean, it seems like the attorney for the Roxall company didn't think there was any update as of September of 2023. Yeah, I mean, this was also during a period of transition for the administration because the previous mayor's administration was on its way out at the end of 2023, and the new administration was coming in as of January 2024. So I guess it's not really surprising to me that there wasn't a lot of movement towards in the second half, really, of 2023 at all, it seems. And this came up, oh gosh, what was the other context in which this came up, where this transition really seemed to be a period of stall? I think it had to do with the finances, the accounting. Oh, no, I know what it was. It had to do with the municipality. I keep saying municipality. I think legally, perhaps, its legal status is a city, the city of Troy. As it says here, the city of Troy. Keep saying it's a municipality. Anyway, the city, its lease. The city of Troy leases its current space, where it houses the city. Okay, whew, we're gonna get there. City Hall is currently in a leased space downtown, and the city's lease for that space was expiring I believe, now I haven't looked at this in a couple months, but if I recall correctly, the city's lease of its space for City Hall was expiring towards the end of 2023. And there's a lot of contention around that transition process and the payment for that lease, those lease payments, because, oh no, I'm sorry, the lease agreement had been, I believe, either a 10 or 15-year contract with the building owner, and that lease expired, actually, if I remember correctly, toward the end of 2022. And the city did not renew that lease agreement. However, it did continue on I'm blanking on what the term is called. I think it's like a holdover tenancy, where it was continuing to make monthly payments on that lease as a holdover tenant. And what ended up happening, apparently, is that there was some talk around because it was a holdover tenancy, the landlord of that space was increasing the rent by, like, I don't remember exactly how much it was, but there was an agreement in place for there to be this holdover tenancy with that increased rental amount being deferred while there were negotiations for a continuing lease. So that was towards the end of 2022, which is interesting timing, because it seems like this particular complaint was filed also towards the end of 2022. And these initial sort of court documents were happening around the same time. This is August into September of 2022, and that was around the same time that the lease of City Hall, the space for City Hall, was expiring, and there was this transitionary period of, do we renew the lease or not? And so that kind of resulted in this holdover tenancy with the deferred increased payment, and that deferment seems to not have been paid throughout 2023. It kept getting deferred while there was this holdover tenancy, so that when the new administration came in 2024, and then here in 2024 getting this letter about they're working on a settlement agreement, that was also around the time where it was coming to light, apparently, this is what has been said, that apparently it was all coming to light to the new administration that this holdover tenancy and specifically the deferred payment, had not been paid. And the landlord was coming back at that particular time, at the beginning of 2024, either the very beginning of 2024 or the very end of 2023, I don't recall. But it was around that time where the landlord was coming back and saying, I want the full payment now. And we're not going to move forward on negotiating a lease agreement, a new lease agreement for this space until you pay me what is owed on this deferred rent. There's this interesting conversation going on about whether the city is going to release that space that it's had for 10 or so years. and or whether it's going to move forward with these RFPs for a whole new space that it will own rather than lease. And from what I understand, the administration is in full support of not continuing to lease this current space and move toward proposals to buy property to then own to house the city hall. And so there's a lot of conversations around that and the implications of that. Yeah, so this is interesting because this filed April 23rd of 2024, basically asking for a written status update before June. So ordered with a question with an exclamation point. That's hilarious. This was April 23rd. Now the other interesting thing, these articles, where were they? Yeah, then this Times Union article, massive Troy salt pile to be removed, lawsuits settled. May 24th. Newsflash. But this is May 23rd. Posted on May 23rd, 2024, which is this is April 23rd. Well, that's interesting. So this is April 23rd, but there was a city news report on May 23rd, which was a month later. Oh, okay, so this is a month later. I'm like confusing the dates here. Okay, so the court asked for a status update on April 23rd of 2023. And then this city news came out exactly a month later. Okay, so the rock salt pile be moved within the next 3 years. In exchange, the city will defer the construction of the final 2 blocks of the South Troy Industrial Road. So they're deferring the construction of those final 2 blocks south of Adams Street for at least another 3 years. Who knows what will happen in that time period? We're here at the Troy Farmers Market on a beautiful, beautiful day.
There's all the things that I don't know, but I know just how the river looks on a day when it feels like rain. What a joy it is to see the river again.
But that's what I was saying. I was like, how do you? I was like, just across the you don't do shit like this.
Oh, hi.
Hello, buddy.
The best roads of all, those that aren't certain. Some of those I hope you'll find me when they drop the big curtain. I'm too old for the term, but I'll use it anyway. Be a child like the wind till the end of my day. Little round planet in a big universe. Sometimes it looks blessed, sometimes it looks cursed. Depends on what you look at, obviously.
I do need like real.
Hear the wind moan in the bright diamond sky. These mountains are waiting, brown, green, and dry. I'm too old for the term, but I'll use it anyway. I'll be a child of the wind till the end of my day. Thank you.
All right, and we're back. Let's get to the other. So this is the Troy slag product. So there's 3 different complaints, sort of regarding the same, within the same orbit. Multiple facets of the planning have progressed, starting with the cleanup of property south of the county jail that is proposed to host the relocated rock salt operation. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So this is still that same area. It seems like they're I don't know specifically where they're talking about moving this salt pile, etc., but they're talking about south of the county jail. So it seems like it would be south of this area is where they're intending to move it. Okay, so it looks like the Troy Local Development Corporation took ownership of land south of the county jail with the intention of relocating the American rock salt and whatever facilities there. Yeah, I mean, I guess it seems like the LDC is intending to acquire title to this land through eminent domain. Now, I may be totally misreading this, but how it appears to me at the moment is that the LDC intends to acquire title to this property south of Adams Street through eminent domain with the further intention of perhaps selling, or not even selling that land, but perhaps I mean, perhaps selling it, but with the intention of entering into an agreement between the LDC and this developer to build facilities similar to what is built on Starbuck Island, which is here. Starbuck Island Luxury Apartment Community. Let's see if you can get a vantage point from here. Yeah, so kind of hard to see, but this is Starbuck Island. Luxury apartments. Actually, I may have captured some of this in the clips from the walk today. It's luxury apartments. I believe they have some commercial space over here, but predominantly it is residential. So that seems to be a top priority that I've seen that I wasn't aware of. I haven't seen any, I haven't heard of any indications that that was in the works. It just, okay, so there's sort of two intentions that I see for this space. There's the building out, the further building out of this industrial parkway. And then there is also the development of a site similar to that of Starbuck Island. Okay, so this is March of 2024. So that news, that city bulletin, if you will, on their website was May 23rd. March 28th. Interesting. I guess it perhaps fell through to some degree. She also, the council for the city, also was hired in 2024. I don't recall exactly what month she started, but I believe she's only been in her position for a couple months, I want to say. All right, well, the last thing we see on this is April 23rd again, that April 23rd date where the court is looking for an update. I believe that's how that last case ended as well, just a court notice on April 23rd looking for an update. And then we have the announcement by the city a month later that they've reached a settlement. Okay, Adams Street Properties. Yep, it's all the same. Okay, well, interestingly also, there's no court filing, at least that is updated or uploaded here, that, well, for lack of a better phrase, that concludes this case on the court docket. It just ends with a court notice that looks for an update. Weird. So the question is, are these cases actually still active in the court system on the docket? Yeah, case status active. Okay, well, that's interesting. Go big. Alright, so as it's reported in this news flash from May 23rd of 2024, where there is an announcement that an agreement has been reached. Even though the cases still appear active on the Rensselaer County website, we're just going to go with this, which says this agreement will be acted on tonight at the City Council meeting. So tonight being May 23rd of 2024. So when I go to the agenda items for the May 23rd City Council meeting, ordinance authorizing settlement of claims filed in Rensselaer County against the City of Troy, the Troy Slag Products, the Adams Street Properties, and the American Rock Salt Company. Yeah, see, this is what's unclear, if this has been filed. Yeah, so the court had asked for an update March 23rd, I believe, or April 23rd. I'm sort of confusing the dates. I believe it was around April 23rd that the court asked for an update, and then it was May 23rd that the city announced the settlement and that they're having this meeting. Okay, so this is May 14th. If the settlement terms are not approved, the cases will be returned to the Rensselaer County Supreme Court calendar for further proceedings. But the Rensselaer County Court docket still shows active. Right, this is what has not yet been filed, apparently. Okay, so I guess they're still intending to complete the parkway simultaneously with continuing to lease the property to these companies to continue their business operations for a temporary period of time. Honestly, the specifics of what's actually happening in this construction development isn't even why I really was interested in exploring this arrangement, this settlement. I was more curious about the sort of legalities, the structures around the eminent domain claim. But I don't really see a lot about that. I mean, I guess they mentioned the statute that this falls under, the eminent domain proceeding. Yeah, I mean, the specifics are like kind of whatever. I guess my question really is, why did there need to be or I guess maybe I wasn't reading this quite correctly, that the claims that were filed against the city I don't know. I guess I'm like still I'm confused now about how eminent domain really came into this picture at all to begin with. Because it seems like there was a time prior to the filings of the complaints where the title to those pieces of property that were in dispute vested in the city. So title was already vested in the city. How that came to be, is another question, but it's not clear to me whether it's just not clear to me why they were filing these complaints under eminent domain at all, when it seems like a year prior to the claims being filed, title to these properties had already vested in the city. So I feel like I'm kind of left with more questions than answers at this point, and I don't know how much I feel like actually continuing to... Okay, so licensor. So the city is the owner of property pursuant to an eminent domain proceeding. Okay, so each licensee filed a claim against the licensor for compensation owed as a result of the takings of a portion of the property. Now, I am still interested in this other resolution. There's another resolution here, or excuse me, there's another proposed ordinance here. Ordinance accepting transfer of a water line constructed by the U.S. EPA to supply City of Troy drinking water to Waterford and Half Moon, and accepting waterline utility easements located on private lands in the City of Troy. So that makes sense. Having utility easements. So basically the city being granted, being given consent, so to speak, by the private landowner to have access to the property for purposes of maintaining, constructing this utility. So there are similar things for like utility poles and perhaps for sidewalks, not really sure, but that makes sense, especially within this context of like this fine line sort of between this governmental question around governmental authority and private. And so this easement, I'm interested in reading this. I'm not going to do that right now, but I am interested in exploring this as well, because I think that this is going to shed some light on that sort of infrastructural arrangement. Okay, moving on to, okay, let's see what the city council had to say.
Ordinance authorizing settlement of claims filed in Rensselaer County Supreme Court against the City of Troy by Troy Slag Products Company, Inc., Adams Street Properties, LLC, and American Rock Salt Company, LLC, for property taken by eminent domain.
So I understand for quite some time there's been development of the South Troy Industrial Road, which is a roadway that will direct and divert industrial traffic around the infamous rock salt pile. The city took ownership of a strip of land sufficient for the road going south and also along the back of the Troy Slag and Adams Street property, which are the property that includes the rock salt pile and the one immediately north of the rock salt pile. We were sued by these three entities because if the construction of the road behind these two parcels will eliminate a railroad spur, and the rock salt that is currently stockpiled at that location is delivered via rail. So as soon as we build that portion of the road, the rail access is eliminated for this particular tenant as well as the underlying landowners. So in order to resolve the lawsuit and in order to, more importantly, get a written commitment of moving that rock salt pile south, we were able to happily negotiate not just settlement of these multi-million-dollar lawsuits, but also to negotiate a written commitment to move that rock salt pile within the next 3 years, which would then open up those two parcels for development that's more consistent with your comprehensive plan that you have.
Is there anything else the city needs to provide for the relocation of the salt pile? In other words, is the owner of the salt pile solely responsible for the relocation of that salt pile? We do nothing.
Other than
It's up to them to find the land. It's up to them to pay the cost to move the salt pile. All of that.
Well, it doesn't need to be moved if it's done over time. You just have to accept deliveries at a new location, leave the existing location, and then the pile will be gone. My understanding is that there is already currently a location in mind. Whether there's any written agreements to that effect, I don't know. The reason it can't be moved right now is because there is some environmental abatement going on that site with an uncertain end date. So that's why we ended up negotiating somewhat of a window, is based on the commitment we were unable to get with respect to the new site. Had that site been immediately available, this would have been a much shorter turnaround. Those two properties that we're talking about that are affected by this settlement are the two northernmost projects. So all of the other industrial traffic is already moved. And by crossing the bridge, we've provided access for these two properties to go south on the industrial road. So the rerouting of the industrial traffic is complete by getting to the point where we're pausing.
Any connection made from the end of the bridge as constructed by the current project and the future project will provide a public right-of-way between Adams and the bridge.
Correct.
Okay.
Finally, we're moving the salt pile, and I think people from Troy are going to be overjoyed.
And I commend you, the mayor and the deputy mayor, for getting this going. And this has been a long waiting, and it's been a priority from day one. And we've been waiting for a very long time to get this done for years.
I will echo the echo and say that it's nice to get it over the finish line, and want to commend the previous administration for all of their efforts
They did nothing on this.
Oh yes, they did.
No, they never completed it or executed it.
I would respectfully disagree with that. Ordinance 28 is adopted unanimously.
Okay. We're gonna keep on trucking. Okay, so this is the ordinance accepting transfer of a water line constructed by the EPA to supply the city of Troy drinking water to Waterford and Half Moon, and accepting water line utility easements. Okay, so the EPA constructed this water line running from Troy, connecting to Waterford and Half Moon. City of Troy now sells drinking water. Okay, so the EPA desires to transfer ownership of the water supply line to these cities, with each municipality acquiring title. Okay. EPA also has negotiated easements for those portions of the water supply line that have been installed on private lands or adjacent thereto, and those easements will be granted to the municipalities that require access to the water supply line for operations and maintenance. By accepting the transfer of ownership and the associated easements, Troy will assume all of the rights and duties and to operate and maintain its portion of the water supply line. Easements and declarations of restrictive covenants to protect the public water supplies. Right of access and impose on the property use restrictions. Rights of access, and does give, grant, and convey to the grantees with general warranties of title the right to operate, monitor, and maintain the water line in the easement area, and the perpetual right to enforce said restrictions and rights, which shall be of the nature and character and for the purposes hereinafter set forth with respect to the property. Integrity of the water line. Okay. Right of access. Grantors hereby convey to grantees a right of access to the property at all reasonable times for the following purposes, which right shall run with the land and be binding on grantor. Verifying any data or information relating to the water line. Operation, maintenance, and monitoring. Verifying that no action is being taken related to the easement. Yeah, I don't know. Would replacement of lead pipes, would replacement of the pipe's materiality fall under any of these categories, and or even the integrity of the water line? Is it even the integrity of the water line that's in question with replacing lead pipes, or is it the sort of the health and how the water line influences the quality of the water? And it's interesting how in this, how it mentioned up above that the city of Troy was selling water to these other towns. So there is some authority, ownership, if you will, commoditization of water, and yet there seems to be contention around whether replacement of what appears to largely be under the municipality's duty to, or responsibility. When it comes to that responsibility, there's this question around if that is, I don't even know what question I'm asking here, but they can sell the water, but when it comes to a question around whether they can use municipal funds to replace infrastructure that it is responsible for on private property, they both have the authority seemingly over the water supply, and they have responsibility of the vessel that delivers the water supply. So what's the issue? Whether they have an easement for all of them? I mean, perhaps there is assumption on my end. No right of access or use by the general public to any portion of the property is conveyed by this instrument. I guess it's also interesting, like water. How do we pay for the water usage? How do property owners pay for water usage? Who are they paying? Is it a utility company? I probably should know the answer to this, but I don't currently. Is it taxed? I suppose the water is included in the rent, because I don't pay it directly. Here's the severability clause. I mentioned this in connection with the what bridge was it? The bridge that collapsed. The Francis Scott Key Bridge that collapsed. I mean, maybe it's even perhaps implied with the usage of drinking water. So for the continued supply of drinking water, perhaps there is an implied perhaps it's implied that the drinking water be potable and not harmful to the public. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about it too is in the city's ability to enforce the restrictions and rights regarding the easement property portion, it doesn't really specify at whether that enforcement comes at the cost of the municipality. So with the cost of enforcement, whatever that cost is it assumed? I suppose it's dependent on what the particular rights are that are being enforced, but safe drinking water. Yeah, I mean, the easement agreements don't use the words service and repair. They don't use that terminology. Good morning. On somewhat of a seemingly totally different trajectory from what I was engaged with yesterday, this is I've been having an interesting contemplative morning in the context of income and analogizing, or an analogy came through this morning around the circulatory system and how blood is circulated through the body in a circular sort of recycling fashion. That analogy was also being analogized to a living trust and the form of a living trust, the form of a living family trust. Some really interesting perceptions in coming through in that analogy, and the experience of income, the experience of recycling income within oneself, within family, within the family unit as a family body, what it is to recycle that within the family unit, and what it is to then also receive from outside and from external, so to speak, sources. And so that kind of took me into sunlight, what it is for the body to receive sunlight, what it is for the body to receive water and sustenance. And so I was curious how sunlight is received in the body and how that plays in, interacts with, relates to the circulatory system. And so this video I found really interesting. I listened to the first 40-ish seconds of it and paused it because it actually was speaking to towards something that I hadn't even really formulated, if you will, in this narrative. It just, this essential, I think he referred to it as an essential nutrient, but yeah, so I'm gonna hop right back into this video because it really was speaking. It was doing some speaking.
D deficiency is a really common problem worldwide. Vitamin D is what's called an essential nutrient, a nutrient that our body doesn't make entirely on its own, so it has to get from some other source. And there are two types, vitamin D2 that we need to eat, and vitamin D3, which we get from sunlight or from foods like salmon or fortified milk. Neither of these previtamins actually do anything before being metabolized by the liver and kidneys, but we'll get to that. Either way, we can make vitamin D, but we have to work for it. So
yeah, see, I'm wondering that the process of metabolizing. So this externally sourced material, so to speak, is received, but I think the way he put it was it doesn't actually do anything, or it's not perhaps useful. The utility of it perhaps is not activated until it is metabolized, so it kind of just, it's there, it just exists. And so that's kind of an interesting, if I think about, or in thinking about what that metabolism process is within the analogy of a living sort of family trust, a family unit, in the context also of income, financial resources, and what is that metabolism process? Metabolism, as far as I recall, is something about breaking down perhaps the specific chemical bonds of that particular material so that it can bond with other chemicals. I'll have to explore that a bit more because I don't actually recall really any specifics around what metabolism actually is, other than perhaps some kind of breaking down of chemical bonds. But the other interesting thing that he's saying here is that that metabolic process of activating the utility of the sunlight, so to speak, into vitamin D, or into that which the body is fueled, that you have to, there's some work involved, that you have to work for it. So I'm not quite sure if he's saying here specifically that that metabolism process is what the work is involved in this process. Let me
in kidneys, but we'll get to that. Either way, we can make vitamin D, but we have to work for it.
Yeah. I want to continue listening to what he says before I fully sort of process this, but it's interesting in terms of you having to work for it. It's perhaps not necessarily that you work to receive the sunlight, that you're not working per se to receive that external source of fuel. In a sense, you're not, by not working for it, you're not focusing your attention on the obtainment of that material as the be-all, end-all. It's like that is sort of ubiquitously present. You don't have to per se work for it. You don't have to work for it to exist. Yeah, so you have to make yourself sort of present within the experience of it.
So let's shed some light on the situation. Couldn't resist the pun. Okay, so we don't care about visible light from the sun. We care about the higher energy ultraviolet radiation, or UV light. But we end up with a vitamin D hormone, which is what throws people off. Remember, a hormone is just a chemical that's secreted by a gland, travels through the bloodstream, and has an effect somewhere else in the body. And as a hormone, it's subject to feedback loops and increased and decreased production when is needed, which it's actually really good at. A couple things to keep in mind though. Like as you get older, your ability to crank out D3 goes down. So if you're an older adult, you may need a little bit more sun to get your D3. Exposure to sunlight is still the most efficient way of making vitamin D. And that process starts in our skin, which is something that I wanted to underline because oftentimes we see our skin as just like a protective layer, when in reality it's the largest organ in our body and it's really active in homeostasis.
What is metabolism? Cellular metabolism can be defined as the sum total of all controlled chemical reactions that occur inside a cell. I believe that a better understanding of metabolism could help us finally understand the origin of life itself.
What's coming through is breaking down bonds, or just perhaps reconnecting bonds, shifting the connections of bonds. Some bond reconfiguration. And that just makes me curious about an analogy to the bonds of human connection, the bonds of human relationship. And that's not even just relationship with each other, but relationship with oneself and relationship with the experiences with concepts and relationship with just the external sort of experience of life. So all the relationships and all the bonds, all the connections that are formulated within the experience and how that kind of is reconfigured, how that sort of metabolic process, how that occurs within a framework of income, both produced sort of from within, recirculated within a unit, and received from outside the unit, those sort of essential nutrients received from external sources, and how that is then recycled and metabolized within the family unit, recirculated, regenerated perhaps.
And better help us know where to search for life elsewhere in the cosmos. Food, water, and oxygen are constantly consumed by your cells. Waste products like CO2 are constantly expelled when you breathe. Other waste products, of course, exit through different routes. Your cellular metabolism consists of hundreds of different reactions. To make sense of them all, researchers often separate them into two main categories: anabolic metabolism, reactions that join molecules together to build new ones, and catabolic metabolism, reactions that break molecules apart. Once inside the cell, metabolic reactions take over, transforming those molecules into little bits of you. While we often take this for granted, this concept is so important and so bizarre that it's worth repeating. A cell's metabolism, its internal network of chemical reactions, takes molecules from the environment, the molecules of an apple in this case, breaks them down and transforms them into pieces of the cell itself. That said, scientists studying the origin of life have discovered that one very special series of metabolic reactions, the citric acid cycle, exists in one form or another in almost all species studied so far. The fact that it's nearly universal suggests that the citric acid cycle is both extremely old and extremely important. The citric acid cycle is the engine of life, the core whirlpool inside your cells. Some researchers believe that the reverse citric acid cycle has been misnamed. It likely predates the, quote, normal citric acid cycle by millions of years. In fact, some argue that the reverse citric acid cycle, or something similar to it, might predate life itself and may have kickstarted the first living cells on our planet. You are a whirlpool. I'm John Perry.
Today we're doing an overview of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process by which your cells break down macromolecules like glucose to produce ATP, the energy currency of the cell. Also producing
way too technical. I don't like the citric acid cycle for dummies.
Now, I'm not doing this just to show off or anything. I'm actually doing this for science. Okay. Ugh. You see what happened there? My arms moved, my shoulders moved, my back and stomach muscles moved, my heart pumped blood to all those different places. It's pretty neat, huh? Well, it turns out that how we make and use energy is a lot like sports or other kinds of exercise. It can be hard work and a little bit complicated, but if you do it right, it comes with some tremendous payoffs. Today I'm talking about the energy and the process our cells and other animal cells go through to provide themselves with power. Cellular respiration is how we derive energy from the food that we eat. We can't just use that energy to run a marathon or something. First, our bodies have to turn that energy into a really specific form of stored energy called ATP. People often refer to ATP as the currency of biological energy. Think of it as an American dollar. It's what you need to do business in the US. Same goes with energy. In order to be able to use it, our cells need energy to be transferred into adenosine triphosphate to be able to grow, move, create electrical impulses in our nerves and brains, everything. Now, before we see how ATP...
I'm just thinking about how that sounds to me. It's this energy that hasn't quite been metabolized. It hasn't quite been put into a form perceived with utility, perceived as useful within the current system, within the operation of the current system. Now, that may or may not mean that it has inherent utility, regardless of the operation of the current system. However, in the current system, there is perhaps a particular utility that unlocks that potential, that actualizes that inherent utility in a specific way. So its potential, until activated in a certain way in accordance with the specifics of the operating system. Now, would they say that that potential energy, before it is transformed into that which has utility within the specific system, would they say that that potential energy is synonymous with kinetic energy? Is it just stored value? Is it the store of value? That is the store of value. It is there, ripe for activation.
Is actually put together. Let's look at how cells can cash in on the energy that's stashed in there. Well, adenosine triphosphate is made up of a nitrogenous base called adenine with a sugar called ribose and 3 phosphate groups attached to it. Now, one thing you need to know about these 3 phosphate groups is that they are super uncomfortable sitting together in a row like that, like 3 kids on a bus who hate each other all sharing the same seats. So because the phosphate groups are such terrible company for each other, ATP is able to do this nifty trick where it shoots one of the phosphate groups off the end of the seat, creating ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, because now there are just 2 kids sitting on the bus seat. In this reaction, when the 3rd jerk kid is kicked off the seat, energy is released. And since there are a lot of water molecules just floating around nearby, an OH pairing, that's called a hydroxide, from one of the H2Os comes over and takes the place of that 3rd phosphate group, and everybody is much happy. So now that you know how ATP is spent, let's see how it is minted nice and new by cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration isn't something that just happens all at once. Glucose is transformed into ATPs over 3 separate stages: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Traditionally, these stages are described as coming one after the other, but really everything in the cell is kind of happening all at the same time. But a simple way of explaining it is like this: if you want to make some money, you gotta spend some money. Glycolysis needs the investment of 2 ATPs in order to work, and in the end, it generates 4 ATPs for a net profit, if you will, of 2 ATPs. So the next 2 stages of cellular respiration, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, are both aerobic processes, which means that they require oxygen. And so we find ourselves at the next step in cellular respiration. After glycolysis comes the Krebs cycle. So while glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, where the fluid medium within the cell that all the organelles hang out in, the Krebs cycle happens across the inner membrane of the mitochondria, which are generally considered the power centers of the cell. Then
This is so technical to me. It's challenging to follow along. I'm trying to capture the essence, so to speak, of what is being expressed here, sort of beyond these technicalities, and it's quite challenging.
Another NAD plus comes along, picks up the hydrogen, and becomes NADH. A cycle. And as the carbons get cleaved off the citric acid, there are leftovers in the form of CO2 or carbon dioxide.
Okay. Anyway, I'm not versed in most of these scientific, biological, chemical processes. The ATP process is something that I explored months ago. I don't recall exactly what the context was in which it arose, but I do know that it was something that I was looking into for quite some time. It had to do with something about the energy, or it being the powerhouse, considered the powerhouse of cell generation or cellular life, and that was intriguing to me. Beyond that, I really don't recall much about it other than it being just the powerhouse. So I suppose now is as good a time as any to look back on I had started creating this vision board months ago and added to it periodically. It kind of migrated into the more local scene here in Troy. And for a while, that's kind of where a lot of my focus and attention was going, was the sort of development on the ground here in Troy, the economic development, just the development of structures and what those structures were affording, so to speak, to the community. And what really spoke to me was the sort of perspectives behind those developments, the perspectives that appeared or perhaps were being felt as pushing forward those particular types of development, and what the motivation was. And so that landscape was what I had explored for quite some time after kind of shifting away from this vision board. But now I'm feeling kind of reflective on what the vision board includes because of this rabbit hole, so to speak, bringing up ATP again, because when I was contemplating sunlight and income and even metabolism, at no time did ATP come to mind. But in watching these YouTube videos and having ATP referenced, that sort of sparked the remembrance of the ATP rabbit hole I went down months ago at this point, and it impacted me so much that I felt this draw to include it on this vision board, because it really seemed to be a piece within this larger picture. And so it's interesting actually looking at this board. Okay, so I had up here, this is where I have this ATP kind of in this gear looking symbol. And I have this sunlight, and there's a lot of stuff that's going on around it. But it's just kind of interesting. Here's the mitochondria, is that what it's called? I don't even, yeah, the mitochondria. I have this little brain here because it was akin to me, not only aesthetically as a brain, but kind of that power source of the body. And that's not to say that the brain is necessarily the power source, but there is a lot of generation through the sort of processing of the brain. I like to analogize the sort of workings of the body, both in a physical sense and an energetic sense, a spiritual sense, analogizing the processing of the body, all the bodies sort of integrated together, and analogizing that to the infrastructure of society. It's sort of in alignment with biomimicry. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't know that anything specifically is coming through at this moment, other than the sort of reflection on how ATP and this metabolic circulatory system and processing throughout the body, how that really kind of gives a different narrative, seeing the social network through a bit of a biomimicked lens, or perhaps even the inverse of that, the biologic system, so to speak, mimicked through the mechanisms of the social infrastructure. And that is just absolutely fascinating to me. I see so much of that potential stored value, which is another thing that I actually want to tie back to, because there was a quote in the book that I was reading that I've referenced in a prior video, the book about Bitcoin. And there's a photograph. I took a photo of a segment of this book, I'm trying to find it, that talked about stored value. Let's see. Okay, here. One familiar benchmark says that for a currency to become money, it must function as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. I'm not really quite sure what is meant by a unit of account. That it can be measured? Yeah, extrapolating from the three-part textbook definition of money that we referenced in Chapter 2. A currency must exhibit price stability if it is to function properly as a medium of exchange, in addition to proving itself a reliable store of value and an accepted unit of account. What's interesting to me about this particular quote in this book, and this is what stood out to me as I was reading it, I'm just reminded of it now, is how there's emphasis on medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account. But what stands out in a way more to me is the highlighting of properly as a medium of exchange, a reliable store of value, and an accepted unit of account. What does it mean for a medium of exchange to function properly? What does it mean for a store of value to be reliable? And what does it mean for a unit of account to be accepted? So I feel like I'm kind of going off on a tangent here. I'm not quite sure the connection here at the moment between everything I've been talking about or contemplating, everything I've been contemplating in the last, or not even just contemplating, really just exploring. I don't even know that there's been a whole lot of contemplation, with the exception of within the context of income and the family unit, and sort of that process of self-generation and cyclicity. Other than that, it seems to have been more exploratory of information without as much contemplation about that information yet. So it's sort of like going through the motion of consuming information, a little bit of contemplation, a little bit of processing, but predominantly consumption. So a little less digestion, I suppose. And it'll be interesting to see, perhaps experience and observe how this really starts coming together in a way that feels a bit more connected, because I do recognize how this appears a bit disjointed in this moment, and that's okay. That's okay. I trust this process, and so there is peace in that. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it keeps on keeping on.